Writer humiliated me when I wanted to become a writer, later he praised me. I wasn't supposed to be there. That's the first thing I thought when I stepped into the glass atrium of the Hartwell Writers' Symposium. I had my name on a badge, sure, Merritt Doyle, printed clean in serif font with guest author under it, but the old voice came back the second I saw the room. The low hum of conversation. The older men with elbow-patched blazers. The women with perfect diction and resumes from publishing houses I used to only dream about. I'd made it, supposedly. I was here. And still, part of me felt like I was pretending. The symposium wasn't just any event, it was a gathering of people I'd once believed were out of reach. Writers I'd followed for years. Journalists whose columns had been part of my weekly ritual. And me? I was a debut author, finally published at 34, with a quiet novel that had started picking up momentum by accident. Or maybe not by accident. Maybe by stubbornness. I scanned the crowd until my eyes caught a shape I recognized. There, by the complimentary coffee station, surrounded by a half-circle of smiling admirers, was Professor Thorne. I stopped breathing. Same posture. Same voice, deep and slightly performative, like he was always mid-lecture. He hadn't changed. The gray in his beard was new, but the expression wasn't. The one that said, "I see you, and I've already judged you." I took a step back, almost instinctively. My hand went to the badge on my chest. I thought about peeling it off, leaving, calling the whole thing off. Then someone from the symposium committee waved at me across the lobby. Too late. Professor Victor Thorne had taught at Lincoln Ridge University for 23 years. His name carried weight. A published literary critic, an essayist known for biting prose, and an academic feared and revered in equal measure. When I'd been admitted to his advanced fiction seminar in my junior year, I thought it was a turning point. I'd won a slot after submitting a short story about grief and silence in small towns, what I thought was my best work at the time. He ripped it apart in front of the class. I still remember it, word for word. Doyle, if I wanted to read a diary, I'd find one on a bus bench. This isn't literature, it's wallowing. Everyone laughed. I laughed too. That was the trick. You had to laugh with him so he wouldn't aim again. And when he moved on to another unlucky student, I tried to forget how my hands had started shaking. He never liked my writing. Not once. Each story I turned in came back with critiques that weren't just sharp, they were surgical. No narrative discipline. Pedestrian language. False emotion. He didn't just dislike my work, he seemed personally insulted by it. I told myself it was tough love. That I wasn't ready yet. That the problem wasn't him, it was me. That was the most dangerous thing he taught me. After I graduated, I stopped writing for almost 2 years. Not because I didn't have time. Because I believed him. I believed that what I wrote was useless. That it was sentimental, immature, weak. That I had nothing to say, and even if I did, no one would want to hear it. But it was there, still. That itch. Stories would come to me on the train, in the shower, in the moments between sleep and waking. I started again slowly, in notebooks and scraps. Writing only for myself. When I was 29, I applied to a local MFA program part-time, without telling anyone. A professor there, Benji Lang, became the first real mentor I'd ever had. He read my stories without sarcasm. He gave feedback that stung sometimes, but never crushed. He asked me what I wanted the story to do before telling me what he saw. And eventually, I wrote the novel. A better kind of quiet. It wasn't flashy. It didn't scream for attention. It was about a grieving son, a reclusive father, and the words they never said. Small town. Big silences. All the things Thorne had said were worthless on the page. The book didn't explode. But it resonated. Slowly. First with indie reviewers. Then with a feature in a regional magazine. Then national coverage, NPR. It hit the lower end of a bestseller list for 3 weeks. My editor called me crying. I just sat on the couch, silent. And now, here I was. At the symposium. Where Thorne stood not 5 feet away from the man I used to be. The first words out of his mouth were, "Well. Look who the muse finally touched." I turned to face him. He smiled, arms out like we were old friends. "Professor Thorne," I said. "I read the book," he said. "Didn't expect that from you." "What part?" I asked, not trying to sound challenging but probably failing. He smirked. The part where it got published. There it was. That tone. The same one from class. A mixture of contempt and amusement. The one that makes you feel foolish for taking yourself seriously. Then he leaned in a little. Congratulations, Merit. I mean that. It takes persistence. And maybe I had a small part in shaping that. I froze. For a moment, I didn't understand what he meant. Then I realized he was taking credit. Not overtly. Just enough to plant the idea. You know, he continued, I always did try to push you harder than the others. Because I thought, maybe, there was something. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. He had pushed me to the brink of quitting. And now he was reframing it. Rebranding the humiliation as mentorship. I excused myself politely and walked away, heart racing. In my room that night, I sat down at the desk and pulled out my old hard drive. I still had it. All the feedback. Every single one of his line edits. Every comment. Every email. I reread one from my senior year. It said, "You write like someone who's never understood grief, just the theater of it." It was the story that became the foundation of my novel. I didn't sleep much that night. Tomorrow, I was giving a reading. Thorne would be in the audience. And I realized something. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. About telling the story, not just the one I wrote, but the one I lived. And letting the evidence speak for itself. The next morning, I stood in front of the mirror rehearsing my introduction. I wasn't nervous about the reading itself, I'd done a dozen by now. What unsettled me was the audience. Not the size, but the presence of one man. They'd set up the reading in the old music hall on campus, repurposed now for literary events. The wooden floors creaked underfoot. The chairs were mismatched, some vintage and some newer. It was charming. Intimate. Perfect for a novel like mine. As I stepped out onto the stage, the lights momentarily blinded me, but I spotted Thorne immediately. He was in the second row, leaning back with his arms folded, as if waiting to see whether I'd stumble. I cleared my throat and began. I'd like to read a passage from the middle of A Better Kind of Quiet. It's a moment where the son of Michael sits in his late father's workshop for the first time since the funeral. He doesn't say much, but the room does. There was a hush. I began to read. The words came slowly at first, then settled into rhythm. I didn't perform them. I just let them be. They were soft, not dramatic. There was no twist, no high note. Just the weight of absence and memory filling a room. When I finished, I looked up. Some people nodded thoughtfully. A few smiled. I even saw someone dab at their eyes. But Thorne? He clapped once. Just once. Then leaned in to whisper something to the person next to him. The moderator opened the floor for questions. They came one after another, about the writing process, about structure, about grief. Thoughtful questions. Respectful. Then a woman in the back raised her hand. She looked to be in her mid-20s. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, a little nervously. I was in a writing program where I was told my work was too quiet, too slow, too internal. Your book made me feel like there's a place for those voices. My throat tightened. Thank you, I managed to say. That means a lot. When the Q&A ended, people lined up for the signing. I signed 20 books, maybe more. Some wanted photos. Some just wanted to say, "Don't stop writing." Then, at the end of the line, I saw him. Thorne. He held a copy of my novel, folded loosely in one hand. He wasn't smiling. Would you sign it? He asked, as if daring me to say no. I took the book. Opened to the title page. Thought for a second. Then I wrote. To Professor Thorne. For showing me exactly what kind of writer I didn't want to become. I handed it back to him without looking up. He read it. Said nothing. Just walked away. That night, I sat on a bench outside the symposium center. The autumn air was sharp, but I didn't feel cold. My phone buzzed. A message from Benji Lang, my mentor from the MFA program. Benji, heard about your reading. You did it, man. Proud of you. I stared at the message for a moment, then opened another app. I still had the file. The old folder from Lincoln Ridge. I opened it, clicked through the scanned documents, Thorne's notes, his emails, his marginal comments in red ink. One of them, from a story I wrote my senior year, simply read, "This story meanders like a lost boy in a field. It never arrives." And yet, that story was now a chapter in a novel that had arrived, fully. The irony wasn't lost on me. And that's when I knew I had to do more than just read from my novel. The next day was my panel, mentorship, and the writer's path. They'd asked me to share my journey. I had intended to keep it surface level. Now, I knew better. It wasn't about calling anyone out. It was about telling the truth. I spent the rest of the evening editing my panel notes. Not rewriting, just unlocking. Saying what I had always avoided, and letting the audience, students, writers, maybe even professors, hear what it had actually felt like to be crushed, and what it took to rebuild. That night I slept with my laptop still open. And for the first time in years, I dreamed not of rejection, but of quiet rooms full of possibility. The hall was larger than I expected. The Mentorship and the Writer's Path panel was scheduled in the Northwood Auditorium, a space that could hold nearly 200 people. As I walked in through the back, carrying my notepad and water bottle, I noticed the seats were filling quickly. Students, mostly. A few faculty. Some faces I recognized from the previous day's reading. One or two editors from small presses. And Thorne. Front row, far right. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't frowning either. His face was unreadable, but his presence was loud. I greeted the other panelists, 3 other authors with far more decorated careers than mine, and we took our places behind the long table on stage. A modest sign read, "Writers on Influence, Challenge, and Growth." The moderator began with warm introductions. Each of us got 2 minutes to talk about the mentors who shaped our journey. I was the third to speak. The first 2 authors spoke of professors who nurtured their voice, encouraged risk, and helped them feel seen. Then it was my turn. I leaned toward the mic. "I'm Merritt Doyle," I began, "and like many writers, my journey was shaped by a mentor. But for me, the word shape isn't just about guidance, it's also about resistance." The room stilled. I was told, once, in college, that my writing lacked depth. That I didn't understand what grief really felt like. That my work didn't have the seriousness or sophistication of real literature. I could feel the attention tighten. Even the moderator looked up. I was 19. And when a professor tells you something like that, it doesn't just stick, it echoes. You start to believe that the most vulnerable parts of you, the ones you put on the page, are unworthy. A couple of students nodded slowly. A few others leaned forward. For a long time, I stopped writing. I was convinced I had nothing valuable to say. But what I've come to realize is this: sometimes the greatest influence a mentor can have is in showing you what not to carry with you. I paused, let the moment breathe. I kept all those critiques. Every marked up page. Every email. Not to hold a grudge, but as a record. And when I finally wrote A Better Kind of Quiet, I returned to those pages, not to prove him wrong, but to prove to myself that I could create something honest, despite everything. There was a murmur. A kind of quiet affirmation, not loud, but felt. "I don't tell you this to vilify anyone," I said. "I tell you this because in this room, there are probably students, young writers, who've been told they don't have what it takes. Who are carrying someone else's dismissal like a truth. I'm here to say, it's not. That's not the truth. Your voice is valid. It's yours. And no single authority gets to erase it." Applause broke out before I even finished my sentence. Real, sustained applause. I looked down at my notes, then folded them closed. I think that's all I needed to say. After the panel, I stood near the hallway, thanking a few students who came up to me quietly, some just to say thank you, others to ask if I could recommend writing groups or MFA programs. And then I saw him. Thorne was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, watching the interaction. For the first time, he looked uncertain. His face held none of the smugness I remembered. Just stillness. He walked up slowly. "Merritt," he said. "Professor." He looked at me for a long moment. Then, "You still have my feedback?" I nodded. "I do." He gave a small laugh, more air than sound. I didn't realize it had such staying power. "You never asked." We stood there in silence. I suppose I was harsher than I meant to be, he said, eyes darting briefly. But maybe it helped. In a strange way. It helped me understand what kind of writer I wanted to be, I said. But not in the way you're thinking. Another pause. He seemed to want something, an absolution, maybe. But I didn't know him that. I'll be curious to read your next novel, he said finally. Best of luck. He extended a hand. I shook it, but briefly. He walked away alone. Back at my hotel, I sat by the window with a cup of lukewarm coffee and opened my laptop. Emails had already begun rolling in as students thanking me, a festival organizer asking if I'd consider coming back next year, a literary podcast requesting an interview. But I kept returning to one message from a second-year creative writing student at Lincoln Ridge. Your talk changed something in me. I'd been afraid to write anything personal after Professor T's class. But I started a new story last night. I just wanted to thank you for giving me permission I didn't know I needed. I leaned back and closed the laptop. My chest felt heavy, but in the way that comes after something important has been spoken aloud. There was no anger left. No bitterness. Just space. Space to write again. I left the symposium the next morning, before most of the attendees had even checked out. The rental car hummed beneath me as the highway stretched wide and empty, the sun still low behind the trees. I turned off the radio. I wanted the silence. It wasn't until I was 2 towns away that I let myself feel it, the exhaustion. Not the kind that sleep fixes. The kind that comes after years of carrying something too heavy, and finally setting it down. Thorne had looked smaller the last time I saw him. Not physically. But something in his posture, less certainty, more awareness. It wasn't vengeance that made him seem that way. It was consequence. Reflection, maybe. But I didn't linger on him. Not anymore. That part of my life had closed, quietly, without the drama I once fantasized about. No outburst, no argument. Just truth, calmly offered. And the world had listened. That was enough. Back in Chicago, I stepped into my apartment like I was seeing it for the first time. My books. My desk. The bulletin board where I kept fragments of stories, some scribbled, some typed. For years, I had looked at that wall and wondered whether it meant anything. Now I knew it did. The next few days passed in a strange quiet. Emails continued to arrive. A few journalists reached out for comment on what some were calling the speech that broke the silence. I ignored most of them. I didn't want to be known for a takedown. I wanted to be known for the writing. So I got back to work. The second novel had lived in scattered outlines for a while, half-built scenes, dialogue snippets, themes without shape. It wasn't a continuation of a better kind of quiet, but it came from the same place, unresolved spaces between people, and how we survived the silence. As I sat down to revisit the manuscript, I noticed something different. The doubt wasn't gone. But it didn't roar anymore. It whispered. And I could answer back. I no longer felt like I had to justify each sentence to a voice from the past. No longer carried the idea that certain emotions were too soft to matter. My sentences didn't try to impress or defend, they just tried to be honest. That was new. That was everything. A month later, I got a letter in the mail. An actual letter. Postmarked from a small liberal arts college in Ohio. Inside was a short note from a professor who'd attended the symposium. Merritt. Thank you for your honesty. I've been teaching for 20 years, and your panel reminded me that sometimes we confuse rigor with cruelty. You reminded me why I got into this work to begin with. I've already changed how I give feedback. I thought you should know. I sat with the letter for a long time. There's a phrase I once heard, you don't know who needs your courage until you show it. I hadn't written that speech for anyone but myself. But it had rippled. Quietly. Just like my writing always had. Later that week, I had dinner with Benji, my old MFA professor, in a little Greek place near the university. Over lamb skewers and warm pita, he asked me, so, what happens now? I thought for a moment. I think, I said, I stop trying to prove something to ghosts. And I start writing what's mine. Benji smiled. That'll be your best work yet. That night, I walked home through the city. My mind wandered the way it used to when I was younger, when stories came not as obligations but as invitations. The lights from the shops cast soft colors on the pavement. The air was cool, not cold. As I crossed a quiet street, I realized something. For the first time in years, I felt like a writer, not because someone said I was, but because I had finally claimed it for myself. There was no audience in that moment. No professor watching, no panel waiting. Just me. And a story waiting to be written. The launch of my second novel happened in the most unexpected way, quietly. There was no viral moment, no front page feature. It came out in early spring, with a soft cover and a muted blue design, just like I wanted. The Distance Between Windows was its title, and it was everything I hadn't dared write in my 20s, vulnerable, reflective, less polished, more true. It was about a man returning to his childhood home after the death of a brother he hadn't spoken to in a decade. About guilt, memory, the echoes of things left unsaid. It sold slowly. Then steadily. Not like wildfire, but like roots taking hold underground. The early reviews were gentle and thoughtful. One line stuck with me: Doyle doesn't shout. He listens. And in the silence, something extraordinary happens. That felt right. The story wasn't written to impress. It was written to understand. And this time, I didn't flinch when people said it was quiet. That word didn't sting anymore. It was a style. A signature. Not a failure. A few weeks after the release, I received a message from someone unexpected. It came through my author website. The sender had used his full name. Victor Thorne. I hesitated before clicking. The message was short. I've read both your novels now. I want to say, I was wrong about your writing, and I'm sorry for how I handled our time at Lincoln Ridge. If you ever want to talk about anything, I'd be open to that. I stared at the screen for a long time. My first instinct was silence. Not out of spite, but because I didn't need a conversation. I didn't need closure from him. I had already found it in myself, in the pages I'd written. But I didn't delete the message either. I archived it. That, I decided, was the difference. Before, his words would have haunted me. Now, they were just one more file in a folder I didn't have to open again. Life moved on, as it does. I kept writing. I taught workshops. I mentored a few young writers who reminded me of myself, unsure, raw, hungry. One student, after a class on voice, pulled me aside and said, "No one ever told me I was allowed to write like this before." I smiled. "You don't need permission. Just practice." He nodded, but I could tell it mattered that I'd said it. That's the thing about stories. The ones we tell, and the ones we live. They shape people. Not always with plot twists or drama. Sometimes, just with a sentence. Just with the idea that someone sees you as you are and still believes you have something to say. That's what I'd spent years searching for. That's what I try to be now. One quiet evening, I pulled out the final printed copy of A Better Kind of Quiet. I hadn't opened it in a while. I flipped to the title page where I'd once signed copies for strangers and, reluctantly, even one for Thorne. I reread the inscription I'd given him. For showing me exactly what kind of writer I didn't want to become. Back then, it had been a statement. Now, it felt like a bridge. Maybe not between us, but between who I was and who I had become. I closed the book, set it on the shelf beside its sibling. 2 novels. Both hard-won. Not because of the critics. Because of the climb. These days, when people ask me why I kept writing after being discouraged so deeply, I tell them the truth. Because silence never suited me. Because there were things I needed to say, even if no one else believed they mattered. Because writing wasn't about approval, it was about arrival. And I've finally arrived. Thank you for watching the video. Like it if you watched the video to the end, and don't forget to subscribe. Have a nice day.